Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Shame is debilitating. It ruins relationships, thwarts growth, and destroys hope. It can masquerade as various problems, guilt, envy, pride, resentment, but until you heal the core issue, freedom will remain out of reach. After 25 years of research, our next guest has discovered that sin is a response to shame, and once dealt with, can bring remarkable transformation to even the most troubled among us. Dr. Mark Baker received a PhD in clinical psychology and a master's degree in theology, as well as a certificate in psychodynamic psychotherapy. He serves as the executive director of the Rabbi Counseling Centers in Pasadena and Santa Monica, California. He's the author of several books, including Jesus, the Greatest Therapist Who Ever Lived, which has more than 2 million copies in print, Spiritual Wisdom for a Happier Life, How Your 8 Key Emotions Can Work for You, and You Can Change, Stories from Angola Prison, and The Psychology of Personal Transformation. You can learn more about Dr. Mark Baker at drmarkbaker.com. Joining us now is the author of Overcoming Shame, Let Go of Others' Expectation and Embrace God's Acceptance, our good friend, Dr. Mark Baker. My twin brother, so good to see you. That we have enjoyed a long and very, very life-changing, altering relationship where you and I have bonded as like co-counselors. You've been a counselor to me, and I've counseled you, and we've shared common experiences of our youth, which helped shape our running into the arms of a loving Father and maintaining the perspective that if we had had a perfect Father on earth, there might not be room in our life for the Father we hunted for in heaven. And how to look at life from a much different angle and to inventory the negative and realize that hidden within is a much more encouraging, much more plentiful, much more robust life when you frame things in the proper perspective. Doesn't change what happened.
Right.
But yet our response to it and our victory is in our response, as the promises, 10 of them in the book of Revelation, are to the overcomer.
Right, right. Eric, I've enjoyed and grown from our conversations. I have looked forward to each of them monthly, because in our dialogue back and forth, I always learn something I didn't know before. I hear it from a different angle. I do feel like we think similarly, and so as you respond and add to the conversation, it causes me to think and grow, and I think I'm a better man today because I've known you. So I'm grateful for the time we've had together. I look forward to what God's going to do next in our lives.
And as do I, and certainly he's not finished with us. This is too deep a relationship, too deep a connection for it to be limited by one medium. And I consider you to be my trusted one, the one that in the time of struggle, the first one that I would call when facing that. And I have clinicians here in town that I've worked with in the past, but they're clinical, and this is personal. Right. And there's a difference when you can have, and it's not advisable in a professional capacity to have that personal relationship, but that's where we are, and it makes it easy for us to have a very open dialogue that others aren't as comfortable and aren't as free to share. Right. Because when you go into a therapy session, you are guarded. You're there to uncover something, but you're not willing to just say, okay, here it all is. If you could do that, you would have done it.
You need to be there, exactly.
So
I hadn't thought of starting off this way, but in our conversation, but actually what you and I have just kind of found together, that kind of mutually vulnerable relationship with each other. You're right, that isn't professional, it's just organic, it happens. That is the greatest antidote to shame in our world. The great what we can do to help protect ourselves from shame, which leads to sin. I absolutely believe that. In the church, a core of the sinful behavior that I see comes from unhealed shame so often. And the greatest thing we can do as a prophylactic against that, what can we do to set ourselves up to not have that happen so much? It still happens, but it happens so much. To have mutually vulnerable relationships like you and I have. Can you find someone that you can really be honest with, that you can call up and say, hey, this is what's going on in my life. I'm not proud of it, but I just need to tell you about it. What do you think? And believe what you're going to get is acceptance when you make that call. That you can open up the kimono and feel like I'm gonna get acceptance. It's not advice so much that we need from others, but it's that moment of grace that I can be transparent with you and I can experience grace. And I believe it's the grace of God that mediates from us to us, that is the most powerful thing we can do to protect ourselves from falling into the pit of shame that leads to so many self-destructive behaviors. There's no way to prevent it completely, but there are things we can do to make a difference in our lives, to live in a more whole and stronger way.
Over the years, what I've found is that the more rigid you are, the less margin you have in your life. And we serve a God of margin. We serve a God that says, I want you to stay in your lane, right? But I want to continue to have you head in the right direction. But if you happen to take a wrong turn, right, I'm going to help you, like my GPS says, recalculate.
Right.
Recalculating, and help you get back on. And in a trusting relationship, it's not a matter of right and wrong. It's not a matter of, it's margin to say, okay, there's boundaries. Okay, you're now in the margin of, if you go a little bit further, you're now going to be outside of the margin. You're going to have crossed over. But if in that time when you are drifting and not correcting your course and you're not turning that steering wheel, I have a car now that does it for me. If it sees me without my turn signal on moving, it literally shakes the steering wheel, and it moves the car back. I don't control it. It moves itself back to be, it knows where the lines are. And hopefully that's kind of a God using something in the natural to show us something in the supernatural, that if we're fully yielded unto Him, that when we start to drift, He's going to give us some little shake, right? And then what do you do about it?
Right.
And by having people like yourself, that there is margin, I can say, I'm still struggling with this. I've been fighting this. It's popped back up again. I thought I had it resolved, but we need to open it up. We don't need to open up all the way now, because there's been some healing, but there's still a little pocket there, so we've got to reopen it so we can close it and make it completely closed, so it's not going to open again. And that requires transparency, and I think that when you and I developed from day one was that in our very first conversation there was transparency. That we both immediately began to talk about what classic, just so classic, is parental relationships, where things are shaped. And having the fathers that we had, just again talked to my mother. For the first time, she said to me, the reason why you left home 55 years ago was because when you were born, your father had in his mind exactly who you were going to become.
Right.
And you had exactly in your mind who you were going to become. And it wasn't anything like he had. And
Right.
the friction that was there from the earliest possible time between the two of you, because even as a baby, it wasn't going to be his way. You had your own form of expression, all that, and that frustrated him to the point where he couldn't face it anymore.
Right.
And there was this break. And so she's 95, and I've spoken to her every Sunday for 55 years at 11 o'clock a.m. Sunday morning. And she's now at 95 beginning to talk more about, because I never really understood. I knew his history, but I never really understood why we never had a conversation. She said because he couldn't talk to you without bullying you or oppressing you to try to force
Right.
you, drive you to conform
Right.
to his, and so there was no discussion. It was just orders,
Right.
and I was an American kid. You don't take orders too well in America.
We didn't at that age, that's for sure.
Yeah, so that's where you and I started, and we
Right.
started to begin to say, well, did that give you a sense of abandonment or a sense of shame or rejection or isolation? And it contributed to a lot of things, and a lot of relational things that manifested themselves because you do unwillingly take on attributes that are imprinted upon you,
Right.
that you, if you don't recognize them, you can say all you want, I'm never going to be, I'm never going to say, I'm never going to talk to my children, and you wind up standing on the stairs shouting at them the very same thing that was shouted at you, and
Yep.
you go, where did that come from?
It's ironic and tragic that I know, and you know, people who say, I'm done with it. I don't ever want to hear my father's name mentioned in my house again. I'm not going to be influenced by him. I'm not going to be like him. That's one of the most dangerous things you can say, because it means I'm not going to look at it. I don't want to learn anything. I don't want to understand anything. You are very likely to repeat history if you don't learn from it. And people often come to me starting therapy thinking that my job is to figure out how to blame everything on their mother and father. They want to have a life of no regrets. They want to feel like, I'm not guilty, they're guilty. I'm messed up because my parents are guilty of messing me up. So let's figure out how I can be relieved of my guilt. I don't want to feel any guilt. Well, to live a life of no regrets is what a sociopath says. You do want to look at your history and figure out what went wrong and what you did wrong. And guilt is not unhealthy. We know that even guilt-prone people live relatively healthy lives. The problem is shame. So when people come and they say, I've got this guilt and I want to be relieved of it, and you're supposed to help me blame everything on my mom so I won't feel guilty about anything. I try to help them see that that's not me. You've hired the wrong guy. I'm not going to relieve you of your guilt. But what we are going to try to do is heal your shame. We will talk about your mother and we will talk about your father, but not so we can blame them for your problems today. So we can understand what happened and you can take responsibility for it. We can't change the past, but we can change how we feel about it. And if and I was angry with my father too for he did the same thing to me. He was of that generation where he earned a living, he put a roof over our head, he put food on the table, and that made him the king of the castle. And we were going to grow up to be exactly who he wanted us to be. And if we weren't, we were just flat wrong. There was no space for the grace. There was no concept of grace in that method of raising kids. Kids were literally to be seen and not heard. I couldn't have an opinion on matters that were different from his. That's the way they raised kids. And I don't blame my father for that. But I did have to understand what happened to me as a result of that. You know, and I would have these violent arguments with him, with screaming and yelling at each other. And my mom's in the kitchen crying because here's this, 18-year-old kid screaming at his father, who's screaming back at him. It was a clash of worldviews, a clash of, actually it was personalities. My father was a very intelligent engineer who was an introvert. So he was very successful, but didn't work well with people. I was an extrovert on steroids. And so my very personality was offensive to him. He had no idea what to do with this noisy, what he considered to be arrogant son of his. I was nothing like him. Our personalities were completely different. And so just like your father, he didn't know even how to talk about that. He even said to me once that the way I walked across the room was offensive to him. Just walking across the room, that's I exuded this sort of extroverted energy, and that he found he had no way of understanding that other than arrogance, because he was such an introvert. He didn't want any attention on him, and he thought if I drew attention that there was something just wrong with that. It was morally wrong. So we would have these fights that, of course, went nowhere. I couldn't change his personality, he couldn't change mine, and I was too young and headstrong to know how to talk to him. And I remember years later, I went back and apologized to him and asked for his forgiveness. I remember I was in my 30s. I went to him and said, I just want you to forgive me for all those arguments and the yelling. And when I left home angrily, and I think it was 20 when I actually moved out on my own. So I was in college, somewhere in college. And I just want you to know I'm deeply regretful for the way I talked, for the way I conducted myself. And I also want to forgive you, I said in that conversation. And he, true to his nature, said, well, I have nothing to be forgiven for. He was just locked into his worldview. There's a right and a wrong. We won. We beat Hitler, so we're right. And I'm proud of him for that. He was a decorated war hero. I was proud of him for flying 50 missions. But that's different, than a father and a son having a kind of vulnerable relationship where the grace of God can heal our shame. We didn't have that. And so we both had those scars as a result of unhealed shame that we couldn't achieve. And I had to seek out relationships like ours to find the healing for the shame that was stored in the right hemisphere. The emotional part of the brain stores those painful, traumatic, feeling memories that we don't know how to make sense of until we find healing relations later. And I pray that for everyone, that they find healing relationships, because we've all got it. We've all got these scars. We've all got this shame we're dragging around, and we're blaming our parents or other people, our first wives, or older brother, or that employer that ripped us off. We're blaming them, and blame is one of the key characteristics of shame. If you find yourself habitually blaming others, you've got an issue with shame, and there is a way to overcome that by finding these grace-centered relationships where you can experience healing for being who you are.
The American way is pride. The American way is arrogant. The American way is the exertion of individual rights. And, from a constitutional perspective, that is what the Constitution says, is that I as an individual matter. I have a voice, and I have a vote, and I have an opinion, and I have certain freedoms, and I have the right to express those freedoms. We've now shifted the balance to where the freedoms that I'm exerting are infringing upon your freedoms, and I'm using that, and I'm using it to shame you for having a differing opinion. And there is no margin, there is no intellectual debate where we can as I remember, in prep school and in college, I loved it. I could debate. I could argue. I don't agree with that. And here's why I don't agree with that. And they would come back and say, well, the statistics show. I say, okay, that's great. It's like me asking the question, when will I ever use algebra? Okay, you're teaching me something. Give me an example of when I will use algebra in life. Give me an example. And if you can tell me how I'm going to use algebra in my life, I'm going head on into it. But if you can't tell me how it's going to add value to me and application to me in my career path, then don't make me study it. Right? It's a waste of your time. It's a waste of my time if I can't use it. And I happened to go to a prep school where that was a legitimate argument. Right? Don't teach me calculus if I'm never going to deal with an algorithm, if that's calculus. I don't know if that's
it's in there. Integer or something.
Right. So if I'm never gonna have to develop an algorithm, or I can understand what an algorithm is, right? But if I'm there, so do I have to take it if you can't show me in the path that I'm headed as to where I'm going to use it? And they would say, you've defended your position well. Well, what do you want to substitute? And so I would substitute poli-sci or sociology or psychology or something that did fit what my career path was going to be. And that was a great opportunity because that was the freedom I didn't have at home. That was a freedom I got in an intellectual community where it says, we're putting the best and brightest in this school. We fully expect you to be outspoken. We expect you to challenge the norm. And we've created this educational structure that says, if you can Socratically defend your position, it's fine with us. We have assisted you in developing a cohesive argument, right, to support that we are not opposed to. We don't agree with you, right, but you've presented it well enough and defended yourself well enough to justify you being able to go down that course, and we're going to support you in that. And so when I went off to college, I sought out professors that afforded me that same, and they encouraged me in that, and they strengthened me in that. And so now as an apologist, not knowing that this was going to be preparation for me for 40 years later to become an apologist, that these are the things that make it so that I can build a compelling case for Messiah in any situation with any person, with a Sikh to a Muslim to an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. It's in me. It's a part of my nature and character.
And you're hitting on a really important distinction that we have lost in our society today. The distinction between empathy and agreement. We've conflated those, and it's so destructive for the self-esteem of our young people. To this notion of safe spaces, where we've got to make sure that students never feel uncomfortable. That's a misguided notion. That's not grace. What that is it's a substitute. It's an artificial substitute for it. Now, what actually is powerful is not if you will agree with me. What's most powerful is if you disagree with me but understand me. That's the most powerful relationship. Well, I really see where you're coming from. I think that's really a great argument. I think you've really got good reasons for it. I don't happen to agree with it. That's the most powerful relationship, where we can, iron sharpens iron, where we can see it differently, but still respect each other, but still have respect for differences, but not agreement. Agreement does not bring peace, actually. Empathy does. It's being able to understand where the other person is coming from and value the other person for the differences that we have, but not agreement. I've got a guy who works for me who's a professor, a local seminary, actually. And the students now will complain to the dean if he says something in class that makes them uncomfortable. He says, well, this is just an alternative perspective. Here's this theologian who says this, and this theologian says that. And you need to know that these ideas are out there. And, Tillich says this. And that made the student uncomfortable. So they went to the dean and said, I don't feel safe in this professor's presence because he's saying things that make me uncomfortable. Unbelievably damaging to tell that student that that's a legitimate argument. Life is not safe. The path is not safe. What we need is strength for the journey, not that God will make it safe for us. Psalms 23, probably one of the greatest passages in the Bible. Yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil because you are with me. It doesn't say, well, I'm going to make it safe for you. Don't worry. I'm going to remove all the obstacles in life and make it safe for you. No, growth comes from facing adversity with God with us. Knowing that he's with us in adversity is what creates strength and self-esteem and confidence, and it builds us intellectually, spiritually, morally. But the false notion that we shouldn't have disagreement, a false notion that we shouldn't have adversity, that life needs to be safe, is a really destructive and I think anti-Christian concept. That is not grace. That's masquerading as it perhaps, but I think it's a false notion that does not produce maturity in the next generation. I'm very concerned about these kinds of ideas. They're not helpful.
Dr. Everett Piper, the former president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. I don't know if you know of him. He wrote a book called Not a Daycare. And it was based on the fact that he had students coming and complaining that their professors were teaching these courses and the subject matter was offensive to them. This is a biblical seminary, and that these concepts were offensive to them. And he would say to them, listen, you didn't come here for a degree in your opinion.
Right.
We're not a daycare. Okay?
Right.
You can go to any seminary you want to go to, but if you're going to be at this seminary, this is what we teach. And it's straight from the Bible. And if the Bible offends you, then you need to look in the mirror and say, am I called to be a minister if I'm offended by something the Bible says? Right? So if you're upset with the fact that sin is sin, and you don't get to determine, God has already determined what sin is. You're not the arbiter of sin. He is. He gave us a pathway to understand it. And if you don't like that, and you want to exhibit behaviors that are outside the boundaries of sin, we're not a daycare. We're not here to coddle you and pamper you and take care of you and nurture you. We're here to mold you and shape you into being an expositor and to be a pastor. We are not a daycare, and you are not getting a PhD in your opinion. And it became a national bestseller because this was something that universities are dealing with. I mean, look at what's going on at Berkeley. Look at what's going on all throughout University of Southern California. You can't bring a speaker in that has an opposing position or has a legitimate conservative position if it's not so progressive that it's ridiculous, that they ban you and they shame you for your position. And this is that attack mode. And now it's permeated media, which has become almost the weapon of mass destruction from a psychological standpoint, because if you are a moderate, and look, 30 degrees to the right of center and 30 degrees to the left of center makes up the majority of America. Okay? That's not very far apart. Okay? It's the fringe. I don't know if I ever told you the parable of the brownies.
Yeah, you did.
Okay, so that's that fringe. They're the ones that the outsiders are the ones that take the heat and protect us sweet people in the middle. Right? the media fosters that, and they provoke that, and then you're drawn to a certain media, one that will fuel that in you and empower you. And we're now promoting, for the first time ever, a violation of our Constitution is we now have we have a state religion, secular humanism.
Right.
And it's being promoted at the highest levels of government that this is the religion of America now. It's not Christianity, it's secular humanism.
Right.
Everybody has the right to self-determination. Aristotle could have written the new Constitution of the United States, because all it says, if it feels good, do it.
Right.
And it's shameful.
It is, and I don't know the direction of culture because of this shift in religion. Bottoms has written a book called The Anxious Age. It just came out a few years ago, where he describes a little bit of a historical view of what's happening in the church. Why is it that young people are not going to church? Why is it when they say, what's your religious affiliation, the largest growing category is none, as we've talked about. So we've got the nuns. Why is church, to them, seemingly irrelevant? Now, interestingly, they still believe in God, but they wouldn't call themselves a participant in any particular religious organization. Well, it's because they have a new religion that you're just addressing, that they're replacing it with. In the new religion, there are certain ideological points. There's 4 or 5 points. You got to believe in all these points. Diversity, you know what the points are. That if you believe in those things, then you're a good person. So now the new religion is how to determine whether or not I'm a moral person. Well, I have to believe in these 5 things, and they all do believe in these 5 things. And they believe it with a zealousness that any religious person on the planet. I mean, they would put Muslims to shame, who pray several times a day, with the zeal with which they believe their religion. The problem is there's no personal God in that religion. There's no Jesus. To be a good person, to be a good humanistic person, you don't need Jesus. You know, you can just do that. You can decide, okay, I'm going to believe these things and do good works and be a good moral person and believe, yeah, there's a God or higher power or something out there. There's no need for Jesus. And when you remove that personal element, you're taking the heart out of what heals us. What does regenerate our minds? It's a personal relationship with a personal God. What's been healing about our relationship is the personal nature of it. And if you take that out, I think you're going to create a false religion. The problem with fundamentalism, and Jesus was very upset with fundamentalists, the Pharisees, he was just, he had the harshest things to say against religious people. And it's because they had that sort of humanistic belief that if I follow these rules, and if I believe in these 5 things, and I do it with great zeal and great zealousness, I know I'm a good person, and you're not if you don't. And he hated that, just like Freud hated that. And what heals us and what you can't hate is someone who lives out that personal relationship with God and others. And they exude that sort of gracious relationship because of the personal relationship. I'm rejuvenated because of my personal relationship, not my ideology. It's not my thinking that makes me be the person that I am. My thinking helps me do the things I do. But it is my spiritual relationship with a personal God and personal others that rejuvenates who I am and makes me be the person that I am. So we're cutting the heart out of the religion that built this country. We've skyrocketed to meteoric success in a very short amount of time. We were a third world country, and now we're the leading power in a blink of an eye in terms of human history. And I believe it because it was based on, the central notion is that we are created in the image of God. I think that was a core concept in the building of this country. And if we are pushing those core ideals, which are Christian ideals, out, I would be nervous. I would be very nervous about what comes next. Humanism will not sustain the kind of the kind of thriving that we've seen in this country the last 300 years. Humanism won't sustain it.
Without leadership, without a vision, the people perish. God has historically judged the body by the head. And so as we look at this new administration, where are they heading us? What direction are they heading us in? And what can be undone and what cannot? And the psyche of the impact of entitlement, the impact of I'm owed something. People are getting paid more to stay home than go to work. What comes of your sense of value and contribution into society if you're not doing anything, if you are disengaged, if you are on the outside looking in? You're living an exclusionary life. You're isolated. And so what's going to suffer? You're going to defend your right to be a ward of the state and argue for that to continue without paying any attention to the consequence over the long haul of what about your child? What about the kid you're raising? You continue, and what's going to happen is there may not be public schools. There may not be the kind of educational system. There may be things like critical race theory being taught to your children that if you are not proactively engaged in anti-racist activities, you are by default a racist. Right. I'm a Jewish apologist. My life's devoted work is as a Jewish apologist, right, formulated around Romans 1:16. I'm not concerned about racial reconciliation. I'm concerned about the salvation of my people, so that my family and my relatives and Israel doesn't die and perish without the knowledge of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Racism isn't in my wheelhouse. It's not my fight. Anti-Semitism is my fight. But being actively a racial reconciler, it's not even in the Bible. There are Jews and Gentiles. That was the only reconciliation that had to take place. Just because ethnos was a Greek word didn't mean that we were going to break it down to a division over ethnicity. It still meant nations. And it was two nations, Jew and Gentile. That division was over. Right. We were now one in Messiah. Right. There was no further subdividing required. Right. And so that's man interfering with God's plans. Right. And whenever we do that, we suffer the consequences of it.
We do. There is no Jew or Gentile. There is no male nor female. There is no, slave. Right. That's one of those elements of the new religion, and so people believe it with unbelievable zeal because they're trying to replace what I believe is a designed hunger for God. We now know that neurologically we come into this world hardwired seeking relationships. Infant studies at as young as 8 days old indicate relationship-seeking behavior, and we didn't think that before. We didn't think infants had the capacity to distinguish between self and other. We thought everything was just amorphous, and they developed that over the first few years of life. Well, we now know with all kinds of fMRIs and stuff we can do. We look at infant behavior and we see relationship-seeking behavior from birth on, even in utero. So we are hardwired to seek out relationship. I would say designed by God. We come out looking for relationship for something greater than us outside ourselves. And that's fundamental to who we are. We're fundamentally relational creatures, and we're seeking out that relationship. And if we don't find that, we will put substitutes in there. That's what idolatry is. I'm going to substitute something for the relationship that I was designed by God to find. And if I don't find it, I got to put something in there, because I'm fundamentally religious. I'm fundamentally seeking relationship with God. And if I don't find the true God, I will make false gods. And that's what we see all around us, with people with religious fervor following their false gods, because they haven't found the personal relationship with the living one that's there, that they're all hungering and seeking for. And shame is the feeling we feel when we're disconnected. I end up feeling worthless. And in the marriage counseling that I do, I found over the years, people are not fighting about what they think they're fighting about. They're fighting because they feel disconnected. That's why they fight. The thing is never the thing. That's what we say in psychology. The thing is never the thing. Whatever you think, what's the thing here? What do you guys think the thing is here? Whatever they name, that's not it. What it is you feel disconnected and you're mad about that. I want to feel connected to you. And it's not agree with you, it's connected with you. Because I don't want to be with someone who agrees with everything that I say. I want to be with someone who respects and can understand, but not necessarily agree. And that's the strongest bond, that cord, of many strands. That's the strongest bond. I'm seeking out relationship, and it'll never be with someone who's exactly like me and agrees with me, but I'm seeking out relationship because I'm designed to find God first and then others. I need both. I need horizontal as well as vertical. And what we see around us, I think in our country, is the loss of the recognition that personal relationship with the God of the Bible is the core, I believe, of the American ideals that grew out of that has produced the tremendous success we've seen to date. So we'll see what happens next. But I think we're swerving off course.
You mentioned the 8th day. Of course, that stands out in my mind because that's the day of circumcision. So it's also the day that the body begins to produce vitamin K. That's the reason why God set it up on the 8th day, because a baby couldn't clot before then. There was no vitamin K in the system. So it is the first day the body produces vitamin K, which is the clotting factor. So, he has quite an intricate system involved.
Right.
But you made a statement that said that something begins on the 8th day.
Right.
Now, I can only say to you, I don't know what they did to me, but I couldn't walk for a year.
Okay.
All right. Well,
Something.
That was the day of my circumcision. That's every Jewish boy is circumcised on the 8th day. Is that impactful? Think about the fact that you're being held down on a table. It's usually done in the family's kitchen. There's a stranger. So your father is holding your legs down. Your mother is holding your arms down. And a stranger is saying words over you and then takes a knife and cuts you. Now, there's no pain that we know of involved. We don't associate it with a painful experience. And we know that frankincense and myrrh were used as antibiotics and antiseptics. So these were the reasons for them being the gifts, because there was an antiseptic keeping the wound clean and an antibiotic. So you had myrrh, which was sticky, so you applied the frankincense, which was an antibiotic, and then over that you applied the myrrh, which formed a very heavy, sticky covering that couldn't be penetrated by flies or other attacks to allow for the healing. And it's like thicker than molasses, if you have ever dealt with myrrh. So very practical. But the eighth day has great significance in the Bible. Mm-hmm. It's the day of new beginnings. It's the day that a male is circumcised. Is that something that is impressionable, deep down impressionable, that we're able to look at?
The answer is yes. We know that early emotional experiences are encoded in the emotional part of the brain. Prior to thinking, prior to language, we used to call it pre-verbal. We call it pre-symbolic. Those early ages when you couldn't symbolize, you couldn't think, you couldn't talk, you're still experiencing and actually learning from things. We call it implicit knowledge. You know things that you don't know you know. And that starts very, very early. We think that starts actually in the womb. And the relationship-seeking behavior starts by age 8. But the point is this. We've done, I think we talked about this before, a guy by the name of Tronick has done what he calls the still face experiments with babies 9, 10 months old, so a little bit older, where a mother will be engaging the baby, and then we tell the mother just to have a still face, not angry, not sad, just still face. And within 90 seconds, the baby is writhing in pain because I'm not getting the interaction I'm not getting the relationship I was used to. You make a baby noise, the baby responds. There's a mutual regulatory process going on. When that is just stopped, the baby's in immediate pain. So that's before language. That's before the child can say anything or think anything. They're experiencing something and they remember it. That pain, we believe, is the prototype of shame in those early moments, that experience of disconnection, pain that results in disconnection. We don't forget. And it comes up later in life. We know that mothers who are able to regulate back and forth with their babies, and when the baby turns away from the mother that can tolerate that and allow the baby to turn away and wait until the baby's ready to turn back to the mom, as opposed to the mother who has to turn the baby and keep looking, oh, stop crying, it's okay, stop crying. The mother is so anxious that she has to stay in the baby's face. The mother that can tolerate that moment of separation produces a less anxious baby 2 or 3 years later. The mother who can't tolerate that and doesn't really get the emotional regulatory process creates an anxious baby later. So my point is this: way before we can think, and to feel guilty about something, you have to think about it. But to feel shame, there's no thought process involved. You just feel bad. You feel bad about yourself. Shame starts way before guilt. And I believe that babies who had that need to connect that was thwarted somehow, and maybe it starts, I could make an argument as early as day 8, where I'm looking for connection and I'm looking for feeling safe and good, and I feel somehow abused and alone in it. That would be something I wouldn't forget. Now, we have to say that to create significant damage, it has to be repetitive. A one-time event is not likely to create a trauma response in a child, but if it's repeated, the child continually is looking for connection and it's continually thwarted and continually thwarted. That's the beginning of a shame-prone life, one that is reaching out to connect and constantly getting thwarted. And this is before language comes online. We don't forget what things feel like. You know, a year from today, I won't remember what our subject was, but I'll remember how I felt talking to you. I won't forget it. We remember how things feel. We feel it, and we know. It's called implicit knowledge. Like I said, we know, but we don't know why we know. We just know. That's the emotional part of the brain that remembers. And it's so rooted in connection, the feeling of connection and disconnection, which creates shame.
You know, I've told you the story before that my mother had scarlet fever when I was born. So when I passed through the birth canal, my eardrums ruptured. I had a high fever. We were separated. They took me from her, isolated, She went to isolation. I went to isolation. No contact with each other for 5 days. Then she was sick, and a nurse had to come to the house, and I was taken care of by a nurse. And so it was probably 10 to 14 days before I was allowed to interact with my mother. My father, I don't even know if he was in town. He was just, yeah, he could have been out of the country. Who knows? And she and I have talked about that our only reference point to our bond was the 9 months that we did everything together. That's been our frame of reference our whole lives. That when people say, are you and your son close? Our answer is, well, we did everything together for 9 months. We went to the bathroom together, we ate everything we ate. This was our answer because it was such an unusual separation. And of course, 1952, they didn't have where you were in a ward and people came and touched you and did stuff like that. You could have been in a broom closet.
Right.
There's no telling where you were, what you were doing, and how often you were checked on, and they didn't have the holes and the touching and all that stuff. And so there wasn't a nurturing. And I think I even told you that when my sister was pregnant, she went to a class with my sister, and I asked her what the class was about, and she said, I don't know, it was something began with an N, but I don't really understand the whole concept of what they were teaching. And I called my sister and said, what was the class called? And she said, it was called nurturing. I said, and my mother couldn't identify with the concept that you were to nurture a child. You were supposed to pop them out. They were supposed to conform to the standards and integrate into society and go off. That was the framework of the 50s.
Right.
So my independence began at birth, and I was disconnected from them both, so much so that I didn't even live in the same part of the house with the rest of the family. They lived on one floor. I lived on a separate room above the garage, not even a part of the family. So they would gather together, and I would be in my room, and never felt. I mean, there was just no familial connection. So, how does it manifest itself? Is it rejection? Is it is it shame? It wasn't anything I did, but how does that play out? Well, broken relationships. Anger. Short trigger,
Right.
Demanding expectations, frustration with incompetence, dealing with service people. These were not anymore, but these were my touch points that turned me into the Hulk.
Right.
You'd touch me there, and this green guy, I'd tell you, don't touch me there again, because you're going to turn me into something I don't want to be. But they touch me there again, and I turn into it. I spent 7 hours on the phone a couple of weeks ago with Apple support. 7 hours. And I had the most delightful time talking with all the representatives, shared the gospel with some of them. Some of them downloaded the app, and I had this peace about me that they're just trying to do their job, and they're going above and beyond, and that would have frustrated me like crazy. That would have been, send me to your supervisor, dig up Stephen Jobs. Boy, I got a message for him. But I literally spent 7 solid hours on customer service.
Unbelievable.
No agitation, no irritation, just treated them like, they're doing a job, and they're trying to help me out, and they're going above and beyond, and it's not even under warranty. It didn't charge me, fixed my problem.
Wow.
And several of them asked for the web address because they said, listen, we don't remember being on the phone this long with anybody, but let alone 7 hours, and you've never complained, you've never escalated, you just said, hey, let's just work through this. And that was something that was unique, meaning that I have passed that hurdle. I brought resolution to that. That's been transformed, and part of my walk with the Lord of showing love and patience and graciousness and kindness and not putting myself in a position where I had something else to do. So
Right.
this was the only thing I had to do that afternoon, whether it took an hour or 7 hours, it had to be resolved. And so you can work through these things.
You can, and he who has been forgiven little loves little, but he who's been forgiven a lot loves a lot. And you were that guy, and you've been forgiven for being that guy, which empowers you to be able to be a different guy. You know what it's like to be that guy. You know what it's like to feel forgiven, and you can forgive others. Then
Absolutely.
it's a powerful way to live.
It is. Unfortunately, my friend, we've run out of time.
We always
And we always do. But this friendship will last long past this program. I want to encourage every one of you out there to visit drmarkbaker.com, that even if you never speak to him directly in his counseling centers, that his book, Overcoming Shame, is a life-changing looking in the mirror and understanding that if you can get to the root of the shame, assisted or unassisted, and in some cases it may be revealed to you by God, that if you can resolve, forgive, and reconcile that shame, the sin that has been the product of that shame can and will disappear.
Amen.
It's a simple truth backed by 25 years of research, and it has changed my life. And people will tell you, I'm nicer, I'm more patient, I'm more loving, I'm more kind, I'm more validating, I'm a better listener than I ever used to be. Dr. Mark Baker, I love you.
Eric, I love
Thank
you, brother.
you. And I look forward to staying in touch for the
Me
rest
too.
of our days.
I do too. Love you.
Love you too. God bless you,
God
my
bless.
friend. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.